Hi, we're Option Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions. We start the podcast with laughter throughout the room. Welcome to the Shoot Room Session. This is going to be a good one. Welcome, Derek.
Hello. Nice to be here.
Who are you and what do you do?
Who am I? Well, I'm Derek Gow. What do I do? I seem to I exist. That's what I do. I've had quite a bit to do with the restoration of some British mammal species over the course of the last quarter century, particularly water voles and then Eurasian beavers. So I've been one of the people that's been involved in the journey to restore the beaver to the British Isles.
So that's one of the most understated and humblest intros anyone's ever given. If there was a Mount Rushmore for conservation in this country, you are one of, if not the first face on that. We should think about that, actually. Get a mountain for you.
Yeah.
You are a rock star in this field, and everyone knows who you are. And from my perspective and on behalf of the team, you've inspired so much of what we're doing. So
that's very kind.
Thank you so much for being here.
See.
I would love to hear the content page of your story. So where you grew up, how the career started, how you ended up being who you are and what you're doing.
So I was born in Dundee, but I did not live there for long enough to have any sentient memories of, other than the fact it was a fairly derelict place because Empire had finished and you couldn't kill whales anymore and nobody wanted to buy jute. So that was pretty much the end of Dundee. And then eventually I moved to a small town in the Scottish borders called Biggar. I grew up there when I was, I think, 9 or 10 years old. We kept a few sheep. I can't even remember why, because they just seemed to die all the time and be nothing other than a pain in the arse. Anyway, I was given a Shetland sheep for a birthday present, and somebody else gave me a book about old British farm livestock by a guy called John Vince. And it was just fascinating. All these stories about, when you travel through a landscape today and you see Tamworth pigs and White Park cattle or Shetland sheep, nobody thinks about them. At that time, these things weren't there. So the old breeds of livestock, the old Aboriginal forms had all given way in the main to progressive agriculture. So they've been swamped by continental cattle or Charolais sheep or whatever else. So I became very interested in the conservation of these relic breeds of livestock. And also at the time, or shortly thereafter, somebody gave me several sets of Gerald Durrell's books. And equally, I became absorbed by, his great adventures to countries far away where you drank too much of tequila and then you went out and smoked some monkeys out of a tree and then you spent the rest of the day dancing with hookers in a bar. And you look at that and say, well, that's actually...
Have you done that for an evening?
I probably have, but unwittingly. So, at the end of the day, it was those kind of stories that, kind of inspired you. And his ambition to, in the end, have this zoo in Jersey where you brought back little dull brown creatures that were in terrible peril and you bred them in captivity whether they liked them or not, and then you put them back into their environments where the world was a better place. And in 1990 I was lucky, having done a variety of different things, principally in agriculture, but by then I was working in environmental education. I was lucky enough to go and spend the summer school there and a lot of time playing drinking games with the Australians, which I won and which have left me with this piercing pain in my liver, which operates every so often about there. But in the end, it was great fun, and you met some fabulous people from all over the world who are doing amazing things. And then, of course, you look at Britain and think, because we are such a bunch of smart cookies, we'll have all sorted here in our nature conservation programs will be thought through, they'll all be functioning efficiently and as well. And of course, when you come back and you start to look at it, you realise that's not the case. That there's an awful lot of talk and there's an awful big heap of cack, but when it comes to it, we're good at talking a story as a British and then actually not doing very much. We're good at shuffling. So that's kind of my career in a nutshell.
We're on 1990 now, so take us from 1990 to here.
Okay, so 1990, they then turned around and said, do you want to manage a small zoo in the country park? And you looked at it and thought, this is ghastly. We've got, one-eyed owl and a three-legged fox and a senile Russian wolf. Why in the name of God would I want to have anything to do with this? And kill them all. Just get some Zyklon B and finish it. But in the end, I went to Jersey, came back, didn't get Zyklon B. We just let them die natural deaths without hitting them with a pickaxe handle or anything like that. And And then eventually, we there's more money coming into the zoo, and I became more involved in zoos, and it was all terribly, terribly entertaining. But again, the more you have to do with them, the more you realise that, again, there's a lot of talk, and very few of them have much of a function that's actually real, beyond, keeping wild white tigers and making them jump through hoops. So I became quite interested in this interface between the conservation of species and the captive breeding of some species, for which captive breeding was going to be a really important thing. And that principally revolved around water voles. So in 94, I was employed by a company called Barton Attractions, who by then were running the sea life centres, to come down and set up their first ever British wildlife mainland zoo. They paid for us to go to Europe to look at the best of the zoo designs that were there, then to come back with some very fresh ideas. And one of the things that became abundantly obvious was that if we were going to spend a lot of money building, large bespoke aquaria, which were half land, half plants, water voles, fish, to display these things to people, was that we had to understand how you could breed them all. Because this idea that, they had with the aquaria, which at that time was that, you went out to sea, caught a lot of herring, brought them back, put them in a tank, and that was how it worked. You couldn't do with water voles. Many of these species were protected by law. Many of them were very delicate. Most of them nobody understood anything about. So it was my job to start sorting all that out. And in conjunction with a whole range of colleagues and organisations, I spent years making mistakes and eventually got to the stage where we could breed pretty much everything, with the exception of weasels. I've never bred weasels in captivity, but that was always a fairly pointless thing anyway. There was we could breed pretty much anything in captivity. And then of course, the concern rose about water voles, and I began to work with those in some numbers. I then went on to start another centre in the which has now become the Wildwood Trust in Kent, when that project finished. And then when I decided I couldn't stand the chief executive at the time, I came to Devon to live and work, and I work for myself now on a variety of different projects.
Amazing. You've had such an incredible story. So let's step away from your career and talk about the environment in general. How the fuck did we get here? How do we get to the state we've left the natural world in right now, Derek?
Well, what you have to understand first and foremost is that it's not been a quick process. We start in the Bronze Age and we begin to fight with the big animals. So, as soon as you start to farm, you don't want wild cattle coming out of a forest and hybridizing with your tiny domestic cows. And you're trying to tame landscapes all the time. So you're trying to drain the rich swamplands to give you fields that will grow crops. You don't, as I say, you don't want the big wild animals that are left coming out. And of course, the other thing is you also want the big wild animals to eat. So it's not just about even meat. It's, if you look at something like a moose, it's sinew, it's antler, as spades and picks. It's there's so much more. These things were just walking supermarkets. And if you think that's an absurd thing as a British parallel, then would you believe there's a dead moose called Horace that was discovered underneath Blackpool when they were building, some other shoddy emporium at its edge. And they hauled this thing out of what had been a primeval swamp. And the thing has either been hunted on 3 or 4 occasions, because some of the spears that hit its bone are ossified by the bone that formed around it. And what that one animal skeleton tells you is that people knew what it was, and it was hunted again and again and again. And as it lived and got older, well, maybe it was a bit lame, but it was a hell of a lot smarter. And it evaded its hunters on at least 3 occasions. And then the final occasion, when they stuck another spear in it, it fell through the ice of this frozen lagoon and died, and that was it. So we kill the big animals because we want them, or we don't want them because they hybridize with their cows. And then as soon as you start, so when you start to look at the existence of things like aurochs or the wild cattle in Britain, the most recent evidence for the skeletons, though there are some recorded records after the radiocarbon dates, is the Iron Age. So we've killed those by 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. And then you go through every single one of the big animals that conflicted with us, and we killed them. And then you get to the small animals. And so by the time you're sort of involved in the pageantry of the Norman hunts, well, you live in a time when the hunted animals, the things like the red deer and the wolf and the boar, they really won. And there was this wonderful saying that, when the Normans came to England, the only thing they left the English with was their eyes so they could weep. But if you transgressed against the king's interest in his deer, and you were an archbishop or a powerful person, then they'd take your eyes as well. So you go through different times where the emphasis is different, and in Norman times the emphasis is hunting, and Roman times the emphasis is not so much hunting, it's farming. By the time you get to the early medieval times, it's wool. And as soon as you get to wool being this huge commercial staple that builds the British Empire and pays for wars and pays for the palaces and grand abbeys and art and everything else, then the PLCs of their time, the church, the nobles, the barons, don't want these things called wolves running around because it costs them money. You have to employ night watchmen to look after the sheep. You have to employ more shepherds during the day. They're just nothing alone, a pain in the arse. So what they do is they sanctify the Lamb of God. They tell you that Jesus is a good shepherd. And see, these things, they're straight from Satan. And then you set up this hate cult that goes on from then until now. So in the heads of many people, maybe not so much in Britain, though it's there, but certainly in continental Europe where the church ruled, and in North America, this deep visceral hate of that animal comes from Christianity 1,000 years ago, and it's never been broken since. So all these things together bring us into the Middle Ages, when you have Vermin Acts, when people start to make money in the Industrial Revolution and move out into the countryside and build grand houses and palatial parks that they stock with exotic fowl here. And then they employ people called gamekeepers to make sure that the pheasants and partridges that they want to shoot aren't eaten by anything else on the way there. So with every single one of these grinding changes in the human emphasis of land use comes another wave of disaster for the creatures that live in them. And sure, you get to a time by the time you're looking at Britain in the 1950s and 1960s, when you see these kind of wonderful Tunnicliffe prints of old landscapes with harvest moons and horses pulling, the corn or the hay that's been cut back in, just as it's getting dark, and barn owls floating past them and harvest mice in the foreground. Many small creatures adapt to the environments that we create. But in the end, that's not because we were ever benevolent towards them. It's just because it was the way the land was. And then you get to the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, we enter the European Union, the Common Agricultural Policy starts, and then you start to use the pesticides that were developed for war, the poisons, the toxins that were developed for war, to make war on the land, to make war on the insects or the wildflowers, everything else. So that we have a landscape that is entirely tamed, entirely used by us, 23 million acres of Britain farmed, for our own purposes, and which, with every ticking second that goes by, becomes more and more devoid of life.
That's how it worked. It's the single best answer to any question I've ever asked.
Answer.
It was incredible and depressingly incredible. Yeah, it's what chapter are we in now, Derek?
We live in a very interesting time, because I spend quite a bit of time now driving uptown Britain, see different sites, probably creating my own personal hole in the ozone layer. But the vast majority of sites you go to look at, in whatever shape or form they take, are largely played out. And you do sometimes wonder, when you look at another river corridor with everything browsed out on one side by the sheep or browsed out on the other side by the deer, with a toxic sludge flowing between what had once been river or stream banks, just how much lower it's going to get, and whether indeed there is a rock bottom, or we're seeing it now. I mean, it's very occasional you'll go to a site. I mean, there was one in Cheshire the other day where you go around with a landowner who's a remarkable young man who's made his money doing other things, and you see how he's taking his land, converting everything entirely. He's got a blueprint to purchase, 2,500 hectares of where he is, and he's achieving that fast. You'd love him, Richard, and to take this land, to start to love it again, and to put the lagoons back in and restore the dew ponds, and ensure that whatever he does, it doesn't screw up the last of the breeding curlew that are still there. So you saw there are times when you get some real surprises, but in the main you don't. What you get is something that is disappointingly the same. So we are either, but having said that, we're also living in a time where, things like beavers that were just, they were a nothing in this. People talked about reintroducing beavers before, many times in Britain, but it really was, for whatever reason, the idea fell by the wayside and it came to nothing. It failed in the 30s, it failed in the 60s, it failed in the 80s, and now, well, it's a far from perfect situation, but at least this time round we haven't failed, and there's probably somewhere in the region of 3,000 plus free-living beavers and beavers in enclosures in Britain, and every year their numbers grow, and every year more of them escape without a licence into the countryside, which is very good news. And there are free-living boar, and you've got, I think, there are shoots of hope. I mean, there are organisations like yours who are investing huge amounts of money in the idea that you're going to buy a huge amount of land. And the seminal thing with that is that once you own the land, the argument always has been that it's my land, I'll do what I want with it. So I'll flay it like a female slave, or I'll take it and with very great care start to return the wildflowers to the meadows, start to create the sinuosity of streams, start to open up the wet holes with animals like buffalo that go in and dig them up with their horns and enrich the pools with their shit and create, these lovely little insect communities, and the tens of millions that the chicks of crakes can feed on again. But the problem is that as we're doing this, as you're seeing this fresh shoot of growth, is that so many things are running out of time rapidly. So if you look at things like, I was speaking to a colleague in Natural England the other day, and there's this little tiny thing, it used to be called the rockfinch. It's a wee bird called a twide. And they're a finch of the kind of northern uplands, and if you'd been on the and they used to migrate down to the Solway in the winter time and then go back to the uplands in the summertime to rear their tiny chicks and feed and sing there through the summer months and feed on seeds. And if you've been on the Solway in the 1990s, you'd have seen flocks of thousands. If you've been in the Solway in 2000, you'd have seen flocks of hundreds. If you've been there any time in between, you'd have seen 10s and 20s and 30s. And I had a chat with them about them. I mean, the situation is very bad. I mean, because you've got, such, burning of the grouse moors and the pennines. These things like to little bird that size, and they like to nest in wee bushes that are about that size and about that high, and they like to have one neighbour there and one neighbour there, so they're nesting in this wee aggregation of them. But because you get so much burning in the uplands and so much sheep grazing, trying to find areas where these wee bushes are there, it's just, even the little things can't find a foothold now. Anyway, the long and short of it was that at the beginning of 2003, now 2023, they're saying, we think there's 3 pairs left. And then they phoned the other day and said, we surveyed and we just don't think there's anything left anymore. So we live in a time where least of what's left is running out of time fast. And so whatever we do, it's very highly, the things, by the time you're down to 3 pairs, that's it. The game's over. It's finished. And whereas it may be possible, and it's undeniably a good to restore biomass. So if you're looking at the farms here and you're saying, right, that's it, the cattle grazing finishes, there's going to be, 20 there just mowing and creating habitats, and the grass comes up and falls over and the field voles go out into the fields and the reptiles follow them. That's super, because those things are the base of the food chain, the insects, and then things start to feed again. But for some of these other creatures, which are either extinct in Britain or so reduced that they're going to finish anyway, we're going to have no choice other than to say, that's it, so be it, they're extinct, or we're going to intervene and we're going to try and bring it to a different outcome. But time after time, when you look at some of these creatures, we are utterly unprepared for what we may have to do, and time after time, we don't understand them at all. So whatever we do is going to involve a considerable, painful learning curve with the potential for making many mistakes. But the alternative is what?
Just sit and accept failure and wait to die.
We've been very good at doing that, and I would suggest that is not a reasonable alternative. It was interesting, actually, when you talked to Natural England. Even they are not very keen on announcing that's going to be the way to do it. But then we are back into, there are maybe, would you believe there are like maybe, 50, 60 of these things in captivity? We don't know where they're from. Some of them may be an old English stock, some of them may be imported birds, because they're in the hands of the cage bird fanciers. And the cage bird fanciers keep them in wee cages of that, take them to cage bird shows on a Sunday and show them off to their wee mates. It's like having a train set, or I don't know, a collection of Paddington dolls. I mean, it's that kind of hobby. But it's that kind of hobby that actually may, would you believe, have the answers to recovery process that none of the rest of us have. None of the smart scientists or nature conservationists know how to breed these. We're going to have to go back to these wee people in village halls with flat tweed caps and whippets.
It's like a movie scene that cuts to the unsuspecting person that saves the world. Like, well, I have to save the world. Oh, right, okay. My take on where we are is pretty damn bleak, and every political announcement that comes is pretty bleaker, from our Environment Secretary upwards and downwards. However, I'm clinging to the hope that you described, the bright, very, very dark day with some hopefully really bright stars there that are trying to do that. And one of the hopeful days we had was last summer when you and a load of other guests came to Leon for the first time. I remember seeing your face when we walked through the Atlantic rainforest there, and you were like, this is really special.
Yeah, like Dartmoor,
yeah. Because it's been protected and looked after, and then that's that whole dichotomy of balancing. You're protecting the environment for people and wildlife, but the reality is you need to protect it from people and wildlife too, and it's an incredibly difficult balance to strike. You in one of your sort of comments was about, I think we regard ourselves as smart people who are looking to develop. We collectively, society, we want to innovate and move on and progress and things like that. The thing that I think keeps getting in all our way is arrogance and entitlement, and it's the fact that we all want to exploit the environment for whatever it is as our preference. So I've had a couple of difficult conversations with people in Scotland and in the southwest and in the east recently, where they've decided to approach us and say, we do not like what you're doing with your land, you shouldn't be doing this. Not they don't like what they're doing on their land or any impact on them, but they don't think we should be prioritising conservation on landscapes. And I don't know how we reach those people, Derek. I don't know how you can be as polite as possible, you can listen to them, but their view is, no, I'm a conservationist because I shoot grouse. And it's just such a mile away from the reality. I don't know. How should I have those conversations better?
Because some of them you're going to make progress with every funeral. And that's it. And there will be no other way for the people who are very extreme and the acolytes who follow them for all the reasons that acolytes do. They're not going to change. They're too committed. They're in a bunker now. They're afraid and in a bunker. And by the time you're culturally afraid and in a bunker, either physically or in your mind, then it's over. And things are changing. I mean, things like, the grouse shooting within their own ranks. They know that the bird of prey thing has brought them down in the habitat destruction and the burning and the carbon emissions that come from if in their heart of hearts, many of them know that it's teetering on
every single grouse moor we've been to are as respectful as possible. So whenever we go view a site or an estate, whether we're buying it or not, I am respectful. This is your landscape. You manage it as you choose. I'm going to listen to understand and learn. I'm not going to challenge how you deal with the landscape unless they ask my explicit opinion, and I won't lie. Without a shadow of a doubt, everyone says, we burn every year, we medicate the grit, we do this and this. That's interesting. How are grouse numbers are their way down? Everywhere. Nowhere's reporting better grouse numbers, despite the fact they're hammering these landscapes over and over. And it's Einstein, right? Doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different outcome. Madness.
But then you see that everywhere. And if you want to go back to the twite thing as an example, I mean, this wee bird's extinct now. It's functionally extinct, the pennines. Not because people haven't tried to change the meadows back to seed-rich ones, and many decent farmers haven't helped. There hasn't been supplemental feeding, there hasn't been this, there hasn't been that. Loads and loads of things have been done, but the problem is that it's very easy for everybody to get into this kind of completely tramlined way of thinking. And if something goes as every year passes and every year gets worse, what you do is you just pick one of the failed strategies that you had, throw even more money at it, and try spending more to see if this time that failed strategy will work. Whereas really what we need to do is there needs to come a point where however uncomfortable it is, you say, this is no good, and we need to stop, and we need to look at it again and say, right, we need to think there needs to be a plan B, and there is no plan B other than failure. And two, if there is a plan B, however unpalatable it is, what is the plan B? Because this is patently not going to work.
No. Everyone's open to talking about the transition to a different way of living, as long as it doesn't affect them.
Yeah.
We want to transition, we want to change land use, but not the bit I do, or not in the place that, and it's that hard reality of being respectful and courteous with people you're engaging with, but the underlying truth that the land is the way it is because the people who have owned it have managed it that way.
Of course.
And we need to change that. And even the estates we go visit and people say, oh, no, we want to change this for nature. And, well, it got there for a reason. So you have to try and navigate that. And we try and do it as collaboratively as possible. But we're all responsible for the state of the natural environment we've got at the minute.
But you also have to, at some point, make up your mind about what you're there to do. And the more, if there's a guidebook with regard to developing a nature conservation policy for whatever, that guidebook will give you, the same set of there'll be the same sort of tedious exhortations within the cover saying that you've got to engage with the local community, consult them, get their views, do this, do that, do this, do that. And in the end, some of it is going to be, it's like the beaver stuff. The beaver stuff is one way or another. Now, you can talk to the reasonable people in between, and you can explain to them what beavers do, and some of the reasonable people will come right round to loving them, for sure. But in the end, for the people that say no, for reasons that are completely and utterly stupid, either it's a no that's picked because you know nothing about it, and then you try and find reasons to justify your position, which is very common, or it's a no that is just ignorant, and you're there because you've got some other reason which is weird and wacky. Well, if that's where you're going to be in history, well then so be it. And I remember years ago, it was one of the, I don't know, it was Roy Dennis. It was an older nature conservationist said to me, Derek, he said, you go into these meetings, and he said, stakeholders, he said, you look at them and they look at you, and he said, don't get the idea for whatever spills from their mouths, these are reasonable people. They are not. They are there completely committed to the overthrow of everything you want to do. They are not your friends. They do not like you. You have to be more determined in the end to do unto the worst of them than they are to do unto the worst of you. That's how it works. It's a struggle. That kind of struggle is elemental. Now, the other things, there are many other things that can be collaborative. And one of the interesting things that happened actually with our place just this year was that, we're in higher level stewardship. That means that you, the taxpayers, pay me money to grow flowers rather than sheep, which is much more gratifying. And we bought a new bit of land, and it sits on one side of us. And we asked Natural England if we could get into HLS, which provides for fencing and reseeding plants and everything else. And they said, it should be possible, Derek. You've got more than enough blackthorn for your brown hair street butterflies. This should be doable. And then they phoned back, 6 weeks later, and said, no, can't do it. I said, well, that's a shame. They said, yeah, well, but let me explain, that what we wanted to do in the Southwest was have 250 people go into higher level stewardship. She said, we've just processed 500 applications. We had 1,500. And as the economics of farming change, you've got more and more people just looking at where the money's going to come from. And
I'm going to pause you there on that point, Derek, so we need to take a break, and we'll come back for part 2, because that's a great way to pause.
Fine.
Thank you. Welcome back, Derek. Awesome part 1. So part 2, I'm going to try and bring it to, so part 1, very reflective, how we got here and where we are. Let's give people hope for a brighter future if we can find it somewhere. So, what is a thing anyone who's owning land right now at some form of scale, that you mentioned the mass influx into Natural England of people wanting to be in higher tier stewardship schemes, and the appetite there to do things differently, economically stimulated perhaps, but still people wanting to make a change. If you are a landowner out there and you want to bring nature back to your landscape, what can they go do tomorrow, Derek? How can they make things a little better?
Well, you've got to look at what financial resources you've got first and foremost, because
great question.
They are challenging for more people than you could ever begin to imagine. And if you look at, little people, it's an issue. But if you look at many of the big estates, which have where you've got young men or women coming in to take charge of them now in this lifetime, and their father turns around and hands them this mixture of failed game shooting, failed farming, failed commercial forest,
half-burnt hillsides,
you've got quarrying, or you've got some other income, then you have one major millstone that's going around your neck for the rest of your life. So you've talked elsewhere about biodiversity net gain and carbon credits, these new funding income streams that come in. But if you just put that to one side and say that's a huge issue, which it is, then what you do is you start at ground zero. You start with enriched pastures, which have no pollen in them, and you say, right, okay, the first thing we have to do is we have to take the skin of the earth, and we have to change its texture. So we have to look at recreating meadows that are full of wildflowers, and these things will provide grazing. They might even provide a hay cut if you're going to have some commercial fulcrum of animal husbandry involved in that to produce higher quality beef or pork or whatever else. But what they won't do is give you 4 cuts of silage a year. That's not possible. So you're going to look at changing the texture of those, because you must have pollens in those and you must have structure. So you've got to drop your grazing animal numbers to get to the stage where not only have you got pollens, but you have a roughy-tufty structure. So it's not all one high. There are big sedges, there are wet areas, there are dry areas where the plants are that high, but they're producing the pollens of the species like the specific butterfly or specific ant's going to feed on. And then what you then do is artificial things. You run around with diggers and you pull out scoops in the land, you reconnect river meanders, you dump big piles of wood or trees in the centre. You bring back the rocks that the Cistercians took away and you dump them right in the middle of your landscape, right the way through it. So when the lizards and the voles move out through the long grass, they can find permanent citadels in which they can live in complete safety. So you then, maybe you plant trees, maybe you drop your grazing ratio or your grazing livestock ratio levels to the point where the trees come away. But it may also be in grassland, or the grassland, especially if it's enriched, is so rich the trees can't take. So maybe you then need to go and disc the soil or rotivate it to create open areas where the willow seed and the birch seed can come back. That's what you do. You can do all these things in different combinations for different landscapes to change the texture. And then you look at how you're going to go forward with some sort of commercial model from there on in.
The beauty of that answer, and for those of you out there, that's exactly what Derek's done on his land. Hearing you tell that story, I can visualise things that you showed me as we went round, and how you've added to places and taken away and stripped back. And I think it's beautiful to hear you articulate what you've done in practice, which is lovely.
It's a beginning.
You kindly came to the Oosterwendenplassen with us this year. Took us, toured us round. That was your first experience of OC as a team. So that was our second-year birthday celebration from the team. What did you think of your time and trip with OC?
Well, before I reply to that, Katie sitting over there, do you want to just pronounce Oostvaardersplassen? Because you weren't very good at either, either. Right, it's called Oostvaardersplassen.
There you go.
It's called the Oostvaardersplassen because it literally means the place where the people went east. So it was the old port of Amsterdam. So see all the sand that you saw there? The sand is the ballast for the sailing ships that was dumped there for centuries. It's not a naturally occurring sand. And what I think of it, it's the most remarkable project. It has its faults, it has its failings, it's hugely controversial. The most controversial, if you put Oostvaardersplassen in the search engine and put animal death, then you'll see all the things dying 2 years ago when the big grazing animals hit 4,500 in the 6,000 hectares.
Well, it comes back to your point about how this change isn't going to be comfortable. If we want to do things dramatically, we want to restore nature. Nature's not pretty. The reality of it is very different from the storybook and the paintings that you articulated.
Of course it is. And the thing with it as well is that you've got to realise that, if you speak to the Dutch guys that were involved at that time, the death level, I think maybe everybody doesn't agree that it was unacceptable, but, when they were talking about death, actually the funny thing was somebody did a study of the people on commuter trains, and if you looked out the window at an eagle was pulling the eyes out of a dead deer, most people weren't that bothered about the deer. If they were pulling the eyes out of a dead cow, cows dying, that's a bit trickier. If they're pulling the eyes out of a dead horse, they go home, they put their galoshes on and they're waterproof, and they go and throw bales of hay over the fence because it's my friend Flicker that's lying there dead. And there's an element of anthropomorphism to it, but it's absolutely a huge part of life. And what that project did was remarkable. It showed you how the big grazing animals could change landscapes. It did not follow the narrative of some of the high priest stuff, and that you had big trees falling over and young trees coming away. Those grazing animals were at such densities that they ate everything. But then equally, politically, it wasn't able to develop in the way that perhaps it should have done with migratory corridors to the higher land in the Netherlands and. But it was a remarkably courageous project, and now it's developing in a different way with a lot more interventive management. But, you know, when we were there and we had a wander around, and we went to meet Mark Wilbur's, you know, the wolf guy on the second day, who takes you into this, you know, forest that's in the heart of one of the most intensively used landscapes in Europe, and tells you there are 9 packs of wolves living in Holland now, or in the Netherlands now, and 18 other animals that are single animals moving through. You see a landscape that from both in a physical and mental sense is palpably changing with the restoration of a creature that was once the greatest natural enemy we ever had. Not a real one that we made up and put in our heads, but one that nevertheless was this massive medieval totem. And now it's there again.
The mad irony is we're inventing right now politically net zero as that enemy that is coming to face us all.
Well, there's that, but I think, I mean, also when you look at the politics of it, and the problem with politicians is that politicians, if you have much to do with them, and I've had a bit to do in my career with a number of them, you find most of them are people who are very shallow. There's no way that reasonably you can expect any individual to adopt and understand the portfolios they have to adopt, especially when they're chopped and changed on a regular basis. I mean, there is a reasonable excuse on that, but you also find that very few of them. So, I mean, DEFRA, for example, the Department of Environment, was just a dog-day outfit. Every time there was a broken old horse of a minister, what they'd do is stuff him in there and hope they didn't fuck up that much before they croaked it and became, you know, senile or were shuffled off to some military care home. And so it was never...
Well, and the flip side of that is when Michael Gove actually started to grab some things and do things, let's get him out of there. He's making this a big job. I spent quite a bit of time with Michael when he was Environment Secretary, and his direction... He listened way more than he spoke, which was really impressive, and he was actually trying to change things. The rest of his politics aside, but the experience I had was really positive of him in that role.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, the beaver thing advanced hugely in his time, and within weeks of the man being in power, you know, he had 4 pages on what a white-tailed eagle would do, and he just told everybody to do it. And he did. You know, he read a lot, he understood, he had good people around him who advised him well. He is and was and is an exceptional politician. But, you know, very few people have come anyway. I mean, Elliot Morley, before he stole all the money, you know, and went to jail, you know, he was a pretty good thinker as well, but, you know, I don't know what, he's still on the go now. He's still somewhere with the ball and chain in Australia. But so the long and the short of it is you generally find that people, you know, that are passing through have little interest and therefore they commit nothing of themselves to doing good.
Well, and the other problem is the system is predicated on not allowing people to change anything. The entire public sector. Yes Minister, in my experience, was a how-to guide to work in the public sector, except it was a bit funnier than the reality. But I'd find myself sat there with storylines from Yes Minister being pitched, and you're like, this is a joke, right? Everyone else can hear this, and no, evidently not.
Well, I mean, it's like, I don't know if you looked at the Beaver book, but we actually have a letter from DEFRA at the time that they said they were going to ban the import of beavers, and it said, but as soon as they say that, because there was this huge pro-beaver lobby, they didn't want to be seen to be unreasonable. So they said that, right, basically we're banning the beavers because we're worried about Echinococcus, which is a disease they virtually never have. But we're going to allow you to bring them in from a number of other European countries. And when you look at the European countries, it was straight out of Yes Minister. So it was like Malta, a volcanic island in the middle of the Mediterranean that used to have giant dormice 30,000 years ago, but it's for its water, it's dependent on desalination, so there's no evidence there's ever a beaver there. What were the other ones? Ireland, yeah, likewise, no evidence there were ever beavers there. There are no beavers in Ireland. Finland was another one. Now, Finland was the actually, no, Svalbard was the best one, because that's Norway's part of the Arctic. There are no beavers there. And I asked what a Norwegian biologist, he was a friend of mine, if there's any possibility of getting beavers from Svalbard. When he finished laughing, Norwegians don't laugh very often. I mean, they're not the kind of people that are greatly given to humor. They're the kind of people that sit in dark bars and eat pickled herrings and talk of the trolls. And when he finished laughing, he said, well, I think we've got a disabled walrus in one of the harbours. If you want a disabled walrus, we'll give you that, but no, there are definitely no beavers. And then he said Finland, and Finland was the cracker, because if you go to Finland, some of the 70% of the beavers there are Canadian beavers. So if you're really going to fuck everything up and introduce a dimension to the reintroduction of beavers in Britain that nobody ever thought of before, go get them from Finland.
Nice.
So, but, you know, that was pure Yes Minister. But again, you know, that's just, it's down to the idiocy of it all. But the problem with this is that as things get worse, as the planet burns or floods to the back lids of our ear holes, is that we rely on politicians. There are politicians in other countries who realise, the ones that are really affected by global warming and climate change, who realise that if you're a small tropical atoll and you're that above sea level, then very soon you're going to have nowhere to live, and it's over. And so there are people there are people of great principle. I mean, you look at the number of environmental activists who are killed every year in their hundreds, principally in South America, who stood for something against big beef or big soya or deforestation. You can't help but have your breath taken away by people. And that's one of the things I learned in Jersey, is when you come back to Britain, which is a sniping, bitching culture of conservation, whereby somebody suggests something and everybody else tries to pull it down, is that it's highly unlikely that any of the people that pull things down are ever going to shoot you. I mean, it's just not a British thing to do, because if they shot you, then there wouldn't be anything else to bitch about. So what you've got is this endless petty culture of people running around with, I don't know, pens, clipboards and paper clips, trying to stab each other on the back with them and just trying to stop stuff. But everything's changed by people. And what you do is you wander into this kind of like landscape. David Waters, you ever been to see the Great Bustard Project? No. You must go and see it. Remarkable people who brought this magnificent bird that's bigger than a turkey back to Salisbury Plain. It's on the crest of Wiltshire's coat of arms. Everybody told him he couldn't do it, and he just went and did it. And to do it, to raise the funding they needed to raise to make the Bustard thing work, which is a 20-year-old project, great complications. He had to use his army pension, his police pension, and work as a bouncer well into his 50s in nightclubs in Salisbury to make it work. His wife had to have 3 jobs, and all the other wee people that helped them had to find these different bits and bobs of money to allow them to bring birds in from Spain or Russia, collect the eggs, develop the infrastructure. It cost $138,000 a year to run it, which is the average income of 3 small hill farms when it comes to subsidies, and they receive not a penny from government for doing this remarkable thing. So you do find people out there doing things that are simply tremendous, but they are people who love their subject desperately, and because they love their subject, they make heroic efforts beyond anything else that would ever be expected of most of the rest of us.
And that's our hope. That's our hope, those people that are those embryonic changes, those glowworms out there that are making things better. So we're in a really fortunate position that we're incredibly well funded. We've been able to buy a huge amount of land as a result of that. In the next couple of years, that's going to the next level. We're going to be able to buy a lot more, which puts us in an incredibly fortunate position, but also big responsibility. So I'm going to deploy a huge amount of capital over those next 2 years to buy land for conservation. How do I make sure I make the most of that opportunity, Derek? What would you most like to see us do with that?
You've bought a lot of land, and now you're going to have to make it work. I mean, I can't tell you how to spend your money, but in the end, I would think one of the most sensible things to do is to see if you can get at least some land that links you directly into the last of Britain's spectacles. So is there a cliffhead estate somewhere where you can watch the orcas swim by in the spring, or there are gigantic colonies of seabirds, or there are white-tailed eagles smashing them out of the sky, and red deer roaring, and kites and eagles and history and splendour? You have to at least have some of that.
By the time this episode goes out, there's a very good chance one of those is under management.
Good. But then the next thing you're going to have to do is be brave and not get involved in all the shit that drags everybody else down.
Yeah.
It's way too easy. So when you look at some of, at least one of your estates, there must be bison running around there, and there's going to be one big ring fence, and you're going to have tours going in as the way we went in the Cranslack, to see a radio, because we know that there's a radio collared cow in the herd, and they're there. So you'll find them, but it will be a special experience for people, and you have to start doing things like this. And you've got, you also, if you've got the funding to do it, you've got to support, one or two of the people like David Waters and extend his ability while these people are still alive and can do, and knowledge to dramatically enhance the prospects of these unique and remarkable creatures which won't be helped by anybody else. If you ask him what relationship he has with the Wildlife Trust, he'll say, well, it's ambivalent. We hardly ever hear from him. If you ask him what his relationship with natural England is, he'll say something else, and it's probably not repeatable in your podcast. But the long and the short of it is that you have to look at the cutting edge of what needs to be done and be at that cutting edge, not just dragging your feet along behind it somewhere with the rest of the fairly sorry pack. So that's what I would urge you to do if you have the ability to do it. And Richard, I'm quite sure you probably already had that thought yourself.
I'm always open to the advice, Derek. When and where are you going to retire?
I think I'm just going to die in a ditch somewhere, or maybe in a bar when I don't know if I like Oliver Reed when I've had my 1 tequila too many. I've no intention of retiring, and this is not a job I do anymore. It's something that's just what I am, and that's it. So
the story I thought you were going to tell is you and I sat up late in Holland having a beverage, and you described, you know what, Rich, I might one day just disappear off to Portugal, I
like Portugal. It's very warm and snug.
and watch the bee eaters.
I think that's going to happen. I think it'll be the rain and Dartmoor in a ditch, or mud.
We've got plenty of rain and ditches.
Yeah, plenty of rain and ditches. I don't know. I have no intention of ever retiring. I would like to get to the stage where, we are forming a small trust as well, and the thing becomes the land, everything we do becomes a part of the trust, and I'm involved with directing the thing as I get older and kicking people up the arse to make sure that we still have some degree of impetus. And that's it. I'd rather not have, the kind of the day-to-day financial issues, the concerns that all come with running something of any size. I'd prefer that wasn't for me. But, all you can do in life is bear with it for the time being until, you flourish, like kind of New Jerusalem, and we're not quite there yet. So.
Green and pleasant land.
A green and pleasant land. I will be retiring anytime soon.
Good. I'm glad. We need you to not. We need all the people fighting for nature and conservation we can get. Derek, this has been a podcast I wanted to do since we had the idea of a podcast. I adore you. Thank you so much for being here. That's us done on the shoot room. Thanks, guys.
Thank you very much indeed. Hooray.